Okay, Dr. Ahmad, we can start.
Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone. Allow me to speak for just a minute in Arabic, and then to get back to English, which will be the language of this meeting. أهلا وسهلا بكل متابعينا في هذا اللقاء الذي تنظمه منظمة القانون من أجل فلسطين. لغة هذا اللقاء ستكون اللغة الإنجليزية، ولكن هناك ترجمة فورية من العربية إلى الإنجليزية ومن الإنجليزية إلى العربية. ولمن يرغب في متابعة هذا اللقاء عليه أن يقوم باستخدام النقر على الأيقونة الموجودة في نافذة زوم على شكل الكرة الأرضية. باللغة الإنجليزية مكتوب تحتها كلمة interpretation، واختيار اللغة العربية. يمكن للمتابعين باللغة العربية التقدم أيضا بأسئلتهم باللغة العربية، وسنقوم نحن بالترجمة. This was just a few words for the Arabic speakers to indicate to them the possibility of translation. Welcome everyone. This is Ahmad Khalifa. I'm an assistant professor in Ain Shams University in Cairo, Egypt, of international criminal law, international humanitarian law. I am honored to moderate this seminar, this meeting organized by Law for Palestine. And we have honorable guests to speak with us about an important topic that is the apartheid system, what Palestine can learn from South Africa. Apartheid is, I'm quoting here a quote from one of our speakers and guests today. Apartheid is a loaded term, saturated with history, with emotion, conjuring up images and memories of discrimination, of oppression, brutality, of indulgence, of privilege, retention, of racism, of resistance, and hopefully, ultimately, of emancipation. These words were the introduction of our one of our speakers, Professor John Dugard, who is doesn't need an introduction, but we are honored to have him as a member of the Law for Palestine board. He is a professor and a former of international law, a former judge in the International Court of Justice, a former UN Special Rapporteur on human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territories. He has been and still is one of the strong proponents of the just objective look at the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and we are very happy to have him with us to speak about apartheid in South Africa and how we can learn in Palestine lessons from this experience. Another guest speaker that we are honored to have is Mr. Shawan Jabarin, the Director General of Al-Haq Organization for Human Rights, one of the most prominent and credible human rights organization in the Middle East. This is my personal opinion, and I am personally very happy to have him with us on the panel today. Mr. Jabarin, among a lot of things, is a member of the Middle East Advisory Board of Human Rights Watch, a Secretary General of the International Federation of Human Rights, and a member of the International Commission of Jurists. Our third speaker, and that we are very happy and honored to have him also, is Dr. Hasan Jabareen. He is a founder and general director of Adala, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel. So he is living and following the situation, is an activist working inside the green light from the Palestinians living inside Israel. Mr. Jabarin is a lawyer with more than 20 years of experience, holding LLM in human rights from the US, PhD, and lecturer in different universities with numerous academic articles published in prestigious law journals. So actually the idea of this seminar, very quickly before starting, is to have Mr. Dugard speaking at the beginning about the experience of South Africa, and then we will pass to Mr. Shawan Jabarin to speak about the works of or how to look at the question of apartheid from the Palestinians' perspective in the occupied territory, and then going to Dr. Hasan Jabareen to speak about the experience of Palestinians inside Israel and how they affront and confront the apartheid regime, and how can we move forward with the newly, let's say, wave of attention given to the practices of discrimination, persecution, and apartheid in Israel in the aftermath of the Human Rights Watch report. Before we start, we would like to welcome all the present colleagues who are present in the Zoom meeting from the Law for Palestine board and members, and also to welcome those who are listening to us on YouTube live streaming. And eventually, as I understand, Al Jazeera Mubashir also will be following this live streaming. So we are happy to have all of these followers to this important seminar. Before I pass the word to Professor Dugard, I would like just to mention that the idea of this seminar and the direction that we would like it to take is how we can benefit from the situation of apartheid that ended in South Africa, how we can learn from this experience in the Palestinian context. We are not focusing, or we would not like to focus on the practices of Israelis against Palestinians and demonstrate that there is apartheid. We are starting, or we wish to start our discussion from the point that let's consider that it is established what is going on as apartheid, and then from this point, where to go, how to move forward, how to put and organize our cards and our the tools that whether international law or international relations, or what the politics in the region and in the world allows us to move forward towards a better situation, towards ending this malpractices. I apologize for this very long introduction, but whether the topic or the speakers or the audience deserved a proper introduction. Now, without any undue delay, I would invite Professor Dugard to take the floor and talk to us about the apartheid regime in South Africa. What can Palestine learn from this experience? Professor Dugard.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm going to say something about apartheid in South Africa and briefly compare it to the situation in Palestine. And then I'm going to turn to some of the questions relating to what Palestine can do in response to apartheid, questions which have been suggested by the organizers of this meeting. Apartheid in South Africa inspired both the Apartheid Convention of 1973 on the suppression of apartheid and the Rome Statute of 1998 of the International Criminal Court, which defines the crime of apartheid. In South Africa, apartheid was premised on race discrimination, territorial fragmentation, and repressive security laws enacted in response to opposition to apartheid. Let me say something first of all about race discrimination. In South Africa, the different racial groups were recognized in law. There were the two main groups, the white group and then the African, the black group, but then there were also two other groups, the Indian group and the colored group, that is the people of mixed descent. Legislation defined all these groups very carefully, and whites were given privileges under the law above all the other groups. Discrimination in favor of whites applied in all features, aspects of life, in social life, education, economic life, political life, welfare, and rule of law. I think in this respect, one can say that it's very similar to the occupied Palestinian territory in the sense that there is a group, the group of settlers numbering some 700,000 today, who have privileges above the local indigenous Palestinian community. But there is one important difference when it comes to discrimination, and that is that in South Africa, discrimination was quite open. The apartheid regime was proud of its policy. It enacted laws which distinguished very clearly between black and white and conferred privileges on whites above blacks. There was absolute transparency in respect to this legislation. And also, to confirm this, notices were placed in public places in order to make it clear that certain facilities were reserved for whites and for other facilities reserved for blacks. So there was beach apartheid, which meant that on the good beaches, there would be a notice saying this beach is reserved for whites only. And then there would be a notice at an inferior beach saying this beach is reserved for blacks only. Same would apply to parks, cinemas, theaters, government offices. Every feature of South African life was divided in this way. But what was significant about the South African discrimination was that it was so open and transparent. In the case of Palestine, it is very different. The Israeli government has learned from the South African experience, with the result that it, to some extent or to a large extent, conceals its discriminatory laws and practices. So there are no notices in Palestine reserving certain facilities for Palestinians and other facilities for settlers. And the law is lacking in transparency. Most of the discriminatory laws are in obscure military orders that are in Hebrew and are not accessible by most Palestinians. I think the distinction between the South African situation and the Palestinian situation in this respect is illustrated by a story told by a former Israeli Minister of Education, Shulamit Aloni. She tells the story of coming across a member of the IDF who was arresting a Palestinian driver for driving on a road reserved for settlers. And I might add that there was no segregation in respect of roads in South Africa. But the driver was arrested by the Israeli officer and was about to have his car confiscated for driving on a settler road, when Shulamit Aloni appeared and said to him, "How do you expect the driver to know that this road is reserved for settlers only?" "Oh," said the officer, "what do you want us to do? Do you want us to put up a notice saying this road is reserved for settlers only, in which case everyone will say we just like apartheid in South Africa and we discriminate?" And that really tells the story of the approach of Israel towards discrimination. It is concealed, but it is highly effective. There's no transparency whatsoever. That's the first issue, race discrimination. Secondly, there's territorial fragmentation. South Africa was divided into different parts for different racial groups. Of course, the white community had all the best land and all the mineral riches, but there were 4 states that the South African government regarded as independent and 5 which were treated as self-governing. So there was territorial fragmentation, much the same way that one finds it in Palestine, with different areas designated for different sections of the community or for different purposes. So we have Gaza, West Bank, East Jerusalem, then we have areas A, B, and C in the West Bank, and then there are certain cantons around the major cities, which further divides and fragments the country. So there too, there's a similarity. Thirdly, there's the security apparatus. And here there's a great similarity between the South African security forces and the Israeli security forces, which are used for suppressing opposition to the opposition of the local community to the system of apartheid. Torture was rife in South Africa, as it is in Palestine. Administrative detention was applied very sparingly in South Africa. In fact, it was only applied to one person who was a prominent political figure, whereas in occupied Palestine, there were always some 200 to 300 administrative detainees, that is, persons detained without trial. When it comes to prisoners, there too, the Palestinian figure exceeds that of South Africa. Since 1967, over 800,000 Palestinians have been imprisoned. That's something like 20% of the Palestinian population. That's much higher than was ever the case in South Africa. There were severe restrictions on freedom of assembly and freedom of speech in South Africa. And that too is the situation in Palestine. The security forces in South Africa consisted of police and army, but the army was used very rarely. In fact, the army was used mainly for taking action against members of the liberation forces in neighboring states such as Namibia, Zambia, Zimbabwe, or Mozambique. The South African army was certainly not as brutal as the Israeli Defense Forces or the Israeli occupying forces, however you like to describe them. There was certainly no equivalent in South Africa of the kind of attacks that have regularly occurred on Gaza. One looks at the attacks at Operation Cast Lead, Protective Edge, and the most recent attack in May of this year. there is no equivalent, or there was no equivalent in South Africa of such military action. Also, on the subject of the rule of law, it's important to stress that opponents of the apartheid regime in South Africa were tried before ordinary courts. They were given proper trial. They were usually defended by opponents of the government, top lawyers in the country. The trial was completely open and transparent and followed the proper procedures of the law. Whereas we all know that in the case of Palestine, the courts are military courts which do not follow normal fair trial principles. It can fairly be said that they are kangaroo courts and that most Palestinian prisoners are in jail as a result of unfair trials. And that was certainly not the position in South Africa. So I think one can sum up the situation by saying that the situation of apartheid in South Africa and that of Palestine are very similar. In some respects, the South African apartheid was worse. In other respects, the Palestinian apartheid is worse. Obviously, the systems are not completely identical, but they are substantially similar. But today, of course, the test is whether a state commits the crime of apartheid in terms of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, a provision which was inspired by South African apartheid. And here, three requirements must be met. First of all, there must be two or more different racial groups. In the case of Palestine, we certainly have that. We have the settler Jewish group, and then we have the Palestinian group. Secondly, the dominant group, in this case, the settlers, aided and abetted by the Defense Force, Israeli Defense Force, must commit inhumane acts such as murder, torture, forcible displacement, persecution. And then these acts must be committed as part of a system of institutionalized oppression and domination by one racial group over the other. These three requirements accurately sum up the situation of apartheid in South Africa, and I believe they accurately sum up the situation in Palestine, and that is why the International Criminal Court in The Hague is considering the crime of apartheid committed by Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory. Of course, Israel argues that there's a major difference between the situation in South Africa and in Palestine, and that is that in Palestine you have a military occupation which is temporary. But of course, we all know this is nonsense. The occupation is now in its 54th year, and one can hardly say that it's a temporary measure, it's permanent. And in this respect, the occupation resembles the occupation of South Africa, if we can use that term, by the white group. Well, so much for my brief overview of the situation. Let me just turn now briefly to the questions that have been raised that we should be considering. First of all, how can apartheid, or how can the Palestinian people benefit from labeling the system under which they are subjugated as apartheid? I think the answer to this is that states and the international community and public opinion understand what apartheid is all about, because they have followed the public description of apartheid in South Africa over decades, and they know exactly what to expect. And if they are led to understand that the system in Palestine is substantially the same, they will appreciate more fully the manner in which people in Palestine are oppressed. So I think that's the most important benefit of labeling apartheid or labeling the Palestinian system as one of apartheid. The next question that has been asked is very easy to answer, and that is, what steps did South Africa take to put an end to apartheid? And in South Africa, a miracle occurred, really. After years of conflict, the apartheid regime and the Principal Liberation Movement, the African National Congress under Nelson Mandela, came to their senses, and they started negotiations. And these resulted in a new constitution and ultimately legislation which repealed all the discriminatory laws. I think the lesson one learns from this is that what one needs in order to put an end to apartheid in occupied Palestine is real leadership on the part of both the Palestinians and the Israelis, which unfortunately is not forthcoming at present. Thirdly, what can Palestine learn from the South African experience? I think that the principal lesson is that unity of the people is important. One cannot effectively oppose an oppressive system if the society is divided. And this is perhaps the most unfortunate feature of the Palestinian situation, that there is this division between West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Gaza. There are other lessons to be learned. I think another one, a more cynical one, is that one cannot put too much faith in the international community. It is governed largely by political considerations which are not very helpful. Finally, I've been asked to say something about the obstacles that Palestine will face in its fight against apartheid. Well, I think the situation in South Africa was easier in many respects, in the sense that the international community was not so sympathetic to the white community of South Africa. In the case of Palestine, we find that many European countries and the United States, quite rightly, are consumed by Holocaust guilt because they behaved so badly during the Second World War that they feel guilty about the way in which they treated Jews. And so they compensate by giving the Jews in Israel a free pass when it comes to illegal action. There's also the specter of anti-Semitism. Today, it's very easy to put an end to opposition in Western countries simply by labeling a person as anti-Semitic. Any politician who supports Palestine too vigorously will be accused of being anti-Semitic, and that's the end of a political career. And of course, there are powerful lobbies in the United States and in Western Europe, lobbies which influence government, which make it very difficult to argue that countries of this kind are truly democratic. I mean, how can one really talk about the United States as being a democracy when it has lobbies such as the gun lobby and IPAC, which determines how Israel is treated by the United States? But I do think it's very important that international law is invoked in order to overcome these difficulties. In recent years, the government of Palestine has correctly, I believe, turned to international law in order to assert its rights and to achieve justice for its people. We do at present have an investigation carried on by the International Criminal Court, which I think is extremely important, because if Israeli leaders, political and military leaders, can be identified as criminals, this will undermine the legitimacy of the state of Israel. There's also a proceeding before the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which has just started. There's also the possibility of a further opinion from the International Court of Justice. And I think these are important ways of asserting rights. There's no doubt that Western states do place great emphasis on compliance with international law, and the more Palestine can show that it has international law on its side and Israel does not, the easier it will be for Palestine to succeed in obtaining its just cause of liberation, self-determination for the Palestinian people. Let me end there and to see what others have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dugard, for this very informative, well-structured presentation, where you basically exposed the whole topic of apartheid in South Africa, its main components, and you did a comparison for each of the 4 components to the situation in Palestine, and then you enlightened us about the 3 main questions of how can Palestine benefit from the South African experience, what are the lessons that that we should take in consideration, and what are the steps that the Palestinians should follow, and finally, what are the obstacles to this roadmap, and then finally, how to circumvent or how to cope with these obstacles. This was very informative, and I think this lays a very good ground for Mr. Shawan Jabarin to speak to us about apartheid and the steps that Al-Haq Foundation and the efforts that Al-Haq Foundation are doing on so many levels from Palestinians in the occupied territory. The floor is yours for 10 minutes, Mr. Jabarin.
شكرا دكتور أحمد. شكرا كثير لمؤسسة ومجموعة القانون من أجل فلسطين، وشرف كبير لي أن أكون مع نخبة من الأصدقاء المميزين، وخاصة الأستاذ حسن وبروفيسور دوغارد. ويجب أن نقول كلمة حق. بدأ الحديث والبداية الأكاديمية في دراسة موضوع الأبارتهايد بالاستناد للسؤال الذي طرحه البروفيسور دوغارد عندما كان مقرراً خاصاً للأمم المتحدة حول أوضاع حقوق الإنسان في الأرض المحتلة. في آخر تقرير له عام 2007 عندما طرح سؤال أساسي بأنه ما يجري بالأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة عام 67 هي ممارسات تحتوي على عناصر من الاستعمارية والفصل العنصري. وهناك بدأ بعدها النقاش وبدأ بعدها البحث، ولذلك عام 2008 وصدر بعام 2009 التقرير المشهور اللي شاركت فيه الحق في حينه، وشاركت في عدالة الأستاذ حسن جبرين كمان كانوا جزء من هذا الموضوع. لذلك أنا برأيي سؤاله جلب هذا النقاش الأكاديمي، ولا زلت أذكر بدقة عندما حضرت فيرجينيا تيلي اللي هي كانت منوط بها يعني إصدار هذا التقرير أو العمل عليه وجمع المواد من خبراء مختلفين. فعندما عرضت السؤال في المؤسسة عندنا كان نقطتي الأساسية هي لا يمكن لنا أن ننظر إلى الموضوع نقفز بالهواء ونتعامل كأننا نريد المساواة مع المستوطن أو مع المستعمر، ونترك من بين أيدينا مسألة أساسية وهي القانون الإنساني الدولي الذي يجرم الاستيطان وغيرها، وندعو سياسيا لإنهاء الاحتلال وموضوع حق تقرير المصير. بصراحة هذه كانت عناصر أساسية وبالغة الأهمية في حينه. وقلت يمكن لنا أن نستخدم هذا المصطلح عندما ندرسه بشكل عميق قانونيا ونرى هل في إطار الاحتلال، وكنت أؤكد شرطيا على موضوع إطار الاحتلال، إنه هل في إطار الاحتلال يمكن أن نقول أبارتهايد ولا لا. وكلف أحد الزملاء وبالتعاون مع عدالة بحثنا في هذا الموضوع، وكان قسم مهم جدا، وكان أحد المشرفين على هذه الدراسة البالغة الأهمية والتي أرست أركان مهمة وقاعدة أساسية هو البروفيسور دوغارت، وكان كمان يعني آخرين من فقهاء القانون الدولي والعاملين فيه. ووصلنا إلى نتيجة نعم، ناميبيا وجنوب أفريقيا مثل في هذا الإطار، ولذلك بدأنا هنا نتحدث بلغة واضحة. أولا وجدنا كل العناصر التي تشير إلى الاستعمار، ولذلك نحن في خطابنا وفي توجهنا عندما ندعو نقول هذا الاحتلال الذي له طبيعة استعمارية وفصل عنصري أبارتهايد في ذات الوقت. هنا نتحدث بهذه الأبعاد الأساسية، وأنا برأيي إذا خرجنا خارج إطار هذه الأبعاد قد يكون هناك بعض التوهات. القيادة السياسية الفلسطينية وبعض الدبلوماسيين الفلسطينيين ارتأوا في موضوع طرح الأبارتهايد كأنه يعني يحتوي على وجهة نظر سياسية تقول بالدولة الواحدة بعيدا عن موضوع إنهاء الاحتلال. وكنا ولا زلنا بصراحة يعني لحد فترة قريبة، أقول لحد فترة يعني ليست بعيدة، لقبل تقريبا عامين، ونحن يعني ندفش بهذا المسألة ونقول لا، يعني ما تخافوا من الموضوع، يعني حتى في إطار الاحتلال وإنهاء الاحتلال وعام 67 يمكن أن تنظر له، وفي إطار الاحتلال يمكن أن يكون هناك فصلا عنصريا، وهناك تشكل جريمة الأبارتهايد، وهذا يعني يعطي للفلسطينيين مساحة أوسع حتى في النضال، إلى أن تطور الأمر بشكل كبير بعد يعني إصدار الحاق وعدالة والمركز الدراسات الإنسانية والاجتماعية في جنوب أفريقيا، إصدار هذا التقرير عام 2009. تطورت الآن وبلغ الأمر بهيومن رايتس ووتش وبعض المؤسسات الإسرائيلية تحديدا يشدين وبتسلم لإصدار مواقف. فصفى أنا بقول اليوم إجماع على مستوى المجتمع الحقوقي الدولي والمحلي والإقليمي بهذا الموضوع. فأصدرت السلطة الفلسطينية أو منظمة التحرير الفلسطينية للدقة أقول ورقة قبل حوالي يعني شهرين بشكل رسمي الذي تقول فيه في موضوع إسرائيل والأبارتهايد. هذا أنا برأيي تطور، وتطور مهم حتى من النواحي النظرية، من النواحي القانونية، من نواحي الفهم لموضوع الأبارتهايد. أصبح هناك إجماع تقريبا في هذا الاتجاه، ونعلم تماما أنه ليس من السهولة بمكان بعض الدول تقبل هذا الأمر، ولكن هذه خطوات، زي ما كانوش يتقبلوا موضوع جنوب أفريقيا ويعملوا معها تعاقدات وتحالفات وتعاون بكل المجالات وكل المساحات، ولاحقا اضطرت الدول الأخرى الأوروبية تحديدا من هولندا وفرنسا وغيرها نتيجة ضغط وحركة الشارع في هذا الاتجاه. فهذا الموضوع أنا شايفه بالغ الأهمية، والأهم من ذلك عندما يتعلق الأمر بالشعب الفلسطيني. فأنا بنظر للموضوع من الزاوية التالية: الشعب الفلسطيني، حق تقرير المصير، ممارسات إسرائيل في الواقع بحق الشعب الفلسطيني. وهنا إسرائيل تسعى دائما لتمزيق الشعب الفلسطيني كجزء من سياسة الهيمنة والسيطرة الكاملة على الشعب الفلسطيني للحيلولة دون تحقيق حقوقه الأساسية، خاصة حقه في تقرير المصير. فهذا جزء من السياسة والاستراتيجية والممارسة الممنهجة الواضحة تماما. الآن في هذا الخطاب أنا بقول نعيد الاعتبار لوحدة الشعب الفلسطيني، ونعيد الاعتبار لعناصر كانت مركبات أساسية في موضوع حقوق الشعب الفلسطيني ونضاله، منها موضوع اللاجئين، منها موضوع الجزء الهام والبالغ الأهمية للشعب الفلسطيني في عام 48، ومنها وحدته على كل المستويات تحديدا بالخارج. لما أقول أنا موضوع اللاجئين، ليس فقط اللاجئين الذين الآن يتواجدون في الضفة الغربية أو قطاع غزة، يعني غزة 75% من سكانها هم لاجئين من عام 48. وبالتالي هذا المفهوم وهذا الفهم لا يسلط الضوء على بعد واحد. أعلم أنا والدكتور يعني دوغارد كنا أعتقد قبل 3 سنوات أو 4 سنوات بهولندا في محاضرة مشابهة في جامعة ISS، وكان هناك لقاء كبير وكان في وجهات نظر مختلفة. كان هو يركز على 67 لأسباب عملية، وأنا كنت أقول نعم، أنا أسند رأيه لأسباب عملية محددة، خوفا من موضوع المتاهة باتجاه كأنك أنت اليوم تدعو إلى المساواة مع المستعمر أو مع المستوطن، وبالتالي تفلت من يديك استراتيجية وأداة القانون الإنساني الدولي الذي يجرم الممارسات 1 و2 و3 و4، سواء نقل السكان أو كل يعني سلسلة والليستة تاعت الجرائم المرتكبة، جرائم الحرب أو الجرائم ضد الإنسانية. فكنا هون يعني نطلع على الأمور بصراحة. ولكن اليوم أقول أنا أكثر جرأة بالقول إنه إسرائيل وسيطرتها الفعلية، لأن هي عمليا تسيطر فعليا على 67، هي احتلال تسيطر فعليا على 67. فأنت هنا تتحدث عن نهج الدولة والمنظومة الكاملة، وتعيد الاعتبار لفهم أوسع وأعمق. وبرأيي هذا يرتبط كذلك بموضوع الحركة الصهيونية وماذا تعني. يعني عندما تتحدث عن الحركة الصهيونية كحركة عنصرية جاية بهذا الإطار، وهذا ما سيحمله تقرير مؤسسة الحق ومؤسسات أخرى بشهر 8 الذي نطلقه كتقرير كبير جدا وواسع وأساسي في هذه المسألة، وإضافة أخرى في هذا المجال الذي يتناول عناصر الاستعمار. وسيلحظ موضوع الحركة الصهيونية ارتباطا بموضوع سياسة وإيديولوجية وثقافة الفصل العنصري. النقطة الأخيرة اللي بحاول أشير إليها، الدكتور يعني البروفيسور دوغارد وفر علي كثير من الحديث على مستوى الواقع والممارسات وغير ذلك للحديث، سواء بإطار 67 أو غيره. ولكن بدي أكتفي بالإشارة لنقطة واحدة، يعني هل يعقل، يعني في عقل ممكن يركب بيقول إنه الاحتفاظ بجثامين الشهداء هذا يقتصر على الفلسطينيين، وعندما يقرر هذا الأمر من المحكمة العليا الإسرائيلية، عندما يعني يقر تحت عناوين الأمن، إسرائيل تتحرك للتغطية على كل هذه الممارسات وكل هذه السياسات في إطار عنوان الأمن. تعتقد يعني أن الأمر قد يكون مش مكشوف في هذا الاتجاه، وتقونن ذلك من ناحية أوامر عسكرية كما أشار لبروفيسور دوغارد بهذا الاتجاه. هو لاحظ كل المسائل اللي كنت بدي أحاول أتحدث عنها، وأنا برأيي سهل في هذا الاتجاه. ولكن أقول أنه إحنا الآن في مرحلة بالغة الأهمية كفلسطينيين، عنوان المحكمة الجنائية الدولية واختصاصها على موضوع جريمة الأبارتهايد، هاي نقطة أساسية. النقطة الثانية أنه جريمة الفصل العنصري والأبارتهايد تستدعي تدخل الدول، خصوصا الأطراف الثالثة والموقعة على الاتفاقية، بأن تتدخل لإنهاء هذه الجريمة ولقمع هذه الجريمة بكل الأشكال، سواء كانت الاقتصادية، السياسية، الدبلوماسية، الإدارية وغير ذلك، وهذا يرتب مسؤوليات على المجتمع الدولي. هذا يسمح لنا بالعودة مرة أخرى لأكثر من مساحة. ذكر الدكتور دوغارد موضوع مسألة الرأي الاستشاري لمحكمة العدل الدولية. هذا أنا برأيي بجوز بحاجة لتوزين في الموضوع، لأني أنا لازلت يعني أثق بكلماته اللي بتتعلق أنه مش في كل موضوع أنت ممكن تروح للمحكمة، ولكن يجب أن توزن الأمور جيدا، لأنه أحيانا كثيرة تكون المحكمة محافظة بقضاتها، ومش بالضرورة أن تكون يعني تحكم لصالحك أو تعطي رأيا استشاريا تقدميا يفيد في هذا الاتجاه. بوقف عند هون وبترك مجال يعني لاحقا للأسئلة والتفاعل في هاي المساحة مشان ما اجتازش الوقت. شكرا لكم.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shawan Jabarin, for this enlightening intervention that built upon and didn't repeat on the presentation of Professor Dugard. And actually, thank you for putting the context of apartheid in the light of the last report and in the light of the practices in Israel, putting the apartheid in the context of occupation, and showing or expressing the opinion that may be debatable by some, that calling what happens in Israel as apartheid does not negate and does not eliminate on its face that we are still against the state of occupation, and we are still calling for ending occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories, and we are still can show that there are other violations of international humanitarian law, specifically of international armed conflict laws, that could be made. This was one of the main axes that we wanted to clarify during our seminar, and thank you, Mr. Jabarin, for putting this in light since the beginning. Now, without any further delay, we pass to Mr. Hasan Jabareen, the Director of Adala for Palestinians inside Israel, about another perspective of how apartheid is also practiced against Palestinians inside Israel, and how can we move forward with this current momentum that is created and putting on stage the practices of Israel against Palestinians inside Israel, inside the occupied Palestinian territories, and even outside with the refugees all over the world. Mr. Dr. Jabarin, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
مساء الخير للجميع, and thanks to Hasan to invite me to this interesting panel and to be with friends, colleagues that we work daily like Shawan, and we discuss this subject, me and Shawan and Adala and Al-Haq, for decades about the question of apartheid and the question of occupation. I am happy also to be with Professor John Dugard, that we work together in the report that Shawan mentioned. And thank you, Ahmad, for this great moderating of this panel. Now, Ustaz Ahmad makes our panel easy in that, and I'm happy that he made that he said, let us assume that we are beyond the question whether Israel exercised apartheid regime or not. So our assumption for this discussion that yes, Israel exercised apartheid against the Palestinian people. Our assumption that more and less we accept the analysis of the report of Adala and Al-Haq, and lately a Human Rights Watch, about describing the regime. Now, having said that, let us go to the hard questions. And this is what I want to do. To deal with hard questions and obstacles and challenges. Now, the first one is this question: whether the framework of apartheid refers only to the Palestinian occupied territories of 1967, Gaza, West Bank, and Jerusalem. This question is relevant because most of the literature refer to the status of these areas. Let us call it, for the discussion, OBTs of 1967. And as Shawan said, the first report in the history of the occupation or the history of the Palestinian people since 1948 regarding the question apartheid, colonialism, and occupation was the report of Professor John Dugard in 2007, when he refers to the OBTs as state of apartheid, also state of colonialism, and state of occupation. And this is why it's very difficult. So most of the literature focus on that. My question is, what is the political values, not legal values, the political values to say that the OBTs is apartheid? If we want to describe it as apartheid in order to refer to the international criminal law, we have consensus on the world that the occupation reached a level of criminality. Now the ICC has to investigate the question of settlements as war crime. And the state of Gaza there and the war and Masirat al-Awda, the last March 2018, also that Israel committed war crimes. So I don't need this framework in order to put the question of war crimes and to highlight it. I have a huge achievement regarding the state of the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. I have the decision of the ICJ regarding the wall. I have lately the decision of the ICC to start to investigate. I have many decisions of the UN regarding the illegitimacy of the occupation. So that, to put it in the framework of apartheid, add minimum political values, giving the situation that the state of apartheid is the negation of occupation. Apartheid speaks about permanent state legal situation of two permanent groups. The occupation speaks about temporary occupation, about temporary control, and not speaking about permanent situation of the settlers in the West Bank. In fact, occupation speaks about their illegitimacy in the West Bank. As Shawan put it, Shawan is still saying until now rightly that the apartheid framework put me in a question of quality between the settlers and the occupying people. Why the equality became relevant in apartheid? Because you are speaking about permanent groups. Two permanent legitimate group and permanent regime and permanent state. The only question is the constitutional identity of the regime, to change it from apartheid to democracy. So to put the question of apartheid as referred to the OBTs only, I think has not bringing serious political values. In fact, create confusion. And maybe it's not that much relevant. What makes the question of apartheid relevant is only when you add to this formula the state of the Palestinian inside the green line. Let me put it directly. The Palestinian citizen of the state of Israel. This is the only group that can make the question of apartheid is relevant. Because bringing the Palestinian citizen to the discussion is putting, first of all, the question of the Palestinian people as one people of analysis. Until now, we speak Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinian Gaza, Palestinian Jerusalem. When you bring them, you bring the Palestinian people as one unit of analysis. When you bring them, you challenge the description of Israel legal regime, that Israel legal regime refers to two legal systems, one democratic system in the Green Line, and one occupation in the West Bank based on the IHL. Bringing the Palestinian citizen, you must challenge the perspective that there are two separate legal systems. So, start to speak about apartheid must, and it's relevant only, and it has its political value only if we speak about the Palestinian citizen of Israel. Because there we bringing strongly the question of equality. There we are bringing strongly the question of racial discrimination. There we are speaking about the question of permanently. And we challenge it. And bringing that also allow us to challenge the perspective that there are two separate legal systems in Israel. Or Israel regime managed two separate legal systems, one democratic, one the Green Line, and one IHL. Because here you have to speak about racial discrimination. Maybe this racial discrimination has different degrees, but it's racial discrimination. Of course, bringing the Palestinian citizen of Israel in this formula add big intellectual question. We are not going to make our life easy intellectually. The first question, well, how Israel could be apartheid regime when the Palestinians inside the Green Line participate in the national election based on one man, one vote? How Israel could be apartheid regime when you have one of the Israeli Supreme Court justices is Palestinian justice? And how you can speak about Israel as apartheid regime when you don't have legally and through the law racial separation between the two groups. Almost there is no law say that Jews and Arab cannot and Palestinian live in the same city, to travel in the same bus. How you can speak about Israel as apartheid when many of the doctors in the hospitals are Palestinians in Israel? And when Palestinians youth study in Israel law, in Israeli universities and teach Israeli Jews. So those serious questions. I ask Hasan to circulate article that I publish in English to deal with those questions, but I will refer it shortly in this discussion. My answer to those challenges are this. Who decides on exercising the fundamental rights? Who decides? The decision here is a Jewish decision. Despite the participation in the election, despite the fact that I am teaching in Tel Aviv University, the only group who decide about exercising the fundamental rights, such as citizenship, land rights and land allocation, security matters, is the Jewish group. So this is one of the most important components that we study from the apartheid. We say apartheid regime is exercised by white supremacy. What's the meaning of white supremacy? That the white group is the only group who decides on fundamental matters. Maybe I will enjoy equality in minor matters, but in fundamental matters, such as citizenship, land allocations, leaving and entering the country, social and economic rights, the only decided group is a Jewish group. Second, when we speak about fundamental rights, we have to show that there is institutional racial discrimination. It's not only that there is racial discrimination, because I can find racial discrimination in many countries that they are democratic. It should be institutional. And here in Israel, our Israel law, Israeli practice, the discrimination against the Palestinians on fundamental matters, not in minor matters, it's institutional. And when I say on fundamental matters, I mean on matters that make citizen a citizen. So the racial, institutional discrimination targeting the rights of citizenship. So whether there is Palestinian justice in the Israeli Supreme Court and there are 10 members of the Knesset are Palestinians doesn't give me any answer about those issues. The third, the security apparatus. The security apparatus is the most crucial, important thing for the peace of the people. Who control the security apparatus? It's police, security decision. The meaning of national security. It's a Jewish. When in Israel,
Jabarin,
yes,
I'm really enjoying. I took a lot of notes, but I have to just remind you that we crossed the 10 minutes since 6 minutes.
Okay,
it's very interesting, but actually I have a lot of questions myself and the other audience, and we will let you more to speak. So finish, please, your idea.
Yeah, thank you.
It's just a reminder. I hate this part of the
No, I wanted to tell you in
sorry.
advance. I wanted to tell you in advance, please stop me because I am lawyer. When you put lawyer on, he will never be off until you give him this comment. So
okay,
I am thankful.
I will accept this invitation. I'll give you 30 seconds to
finish. You speak, let me finish. Speak. Okay, so those challenges, and we have answer for them. And I want to summarize. Lately, we are happy that this new discourse about Israel apartheid, bringing the Palestinian people as one unit and speaking about Israeli regime as one regime, and bring all the groups of the Palestinian people as part of the discussion. I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dr. Jabarin, for this very challenging presentation where you put the whole discussion on a different track, or you added a parallel line of discussion towards this panel. And let me, the next 15 to 20 minutes, we are going to have some remarks on each other's talk among the speakers. And if you allow me, myself also, I will, there are so many points where we can enter these 15 minutes, but I hate to be a speaker beside you. So I will choose one axe through which we will try to look at what each other has presented. And this axe would be the International Criminal Court. Simply because Mr. Jabarin, of course, he raised the issue of the relevance of apartheid when speaking about the occupied Palestinian territories. And of course, he started by thinking that it's not that much useful. And then later on, he developed by saying that maybe it's not relevant at all, and it's only relevant for Palestinians inside Israel. But let me just, in a quick comment,
No, I meant that the apartheid framework is important for all Palestine geography from the sea. Only when you start to speak about Palestinians inside the agreement.
Inside Israel,
to bring them together to the discussion.
Of course, nobody is against this. But let me take the axe of the International Criminal Court because it came across the discussion of Professor Dugard and Mr. Shawan and yourself. And just let me, from the perspective of international criminal law professor, add something that even for the occupied Palestinian territories, raising apartheid as a potential charge in front of the ICC is useful on so many levels. The first level is that international criminal courts do not deal with one atrocity, one qualification of atrocity in a situation. So if you have several practices that constitute war crimes on one hand, and on the other hand, it constitutes crime against humanity, which is the case of apartheid, then this puts more pressure on the defendant, which is the state of Israel, more pressure politically and more pressure in terms of evidence and in terms of even accused. You widen the scope of who is to be accused. This is number one. Number two, actually, apartheid, by its definition, it's something related to a state policy. And as such, as one of our guests, Abdelghani Saeed, who is doing a PhD in Kent, raised in a comment, this is much easier to prove than single individual actions that could be said that as war crimes, that could be said that these are not reflecting political will or policy direction. So bringing apartheid in front of the ICC, in addition to, not in alternative to war crimes, is important on its own in the occupied Palestinian territory, and it's an easier case in terms of territorial jurisdiction before the International Criminal Court, because we cannot, one of the disadvantages of going to the ICC is that we cannot deal with the question of Palestinians inside Israel because the territorial jurisdiction had been defined as per the decision in February by the limits of 1967. But let me, on the ICC, go back to Professor Dugard and ask him if we bring, or if we try to add the question of apartheid before the ICC in the state of occupied territories. The definition of apartheid in the Rome Statute focuses on race specifically. To what extent you think that with the principle of legality in international criminal law, that this definition of race as a criteria of distinction would be acceptable before the International Criminal Court? And here we are talking about apartheid, not only discrimination, but specifically discrimination based on race to the extent of apartheid. And what if the court, in the pretrial jurisdictional admissibility issues, refuses to apply this to the Palestinian? Do you think that this would harm the case of Israel as an apartheid, practicing apartheid in the occupied territories, or the shot before the ICC is worth it? Professor Dugard. You are muted still.
I don't think that we have a problem with definitions of race before the International Criminal Court when it comes to the crime of apartheid, because there is a tendency in some quarters to define racial groups according to their color, but international law in the form of definitions provided by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the Convention on Race Discrimination have always said that one has to look at the sociological aspects, and it is a question of whether a particular group perceives itself to be a particular group with a separate identity. And so when one comes to Jewish settlers and Palestinians, it's quite clear that each group perceives itself to be a separate independent group. So I don't think the International Criminal Court will have any difficulty in finding that there are two separate racial groups in the occupied Palestinian territory, and that this requirement for the crime of apartheid is met. Let me just say on the subject that I think we must accept that there is a great reluctance on the part of the International Criminal Court to entertain the charge of apartheid. The International Criminal Court seems prepared to accept that Israel has committed war crimes, but it hesitates to find that Israel has committed any crime against humanity, and apartheid is a crime against humanity. So there is a political resistance to the crime of apartheid.
Dr. Ahmad, you are muted.
Yeah. Mr. Shawan Jabarin.
One of the points of comparison between South African experience and the Palestinian experience is the political path that went through negotiation in South Africa for years under one clear leadership. And the point of leadership was also one of the main points that Professor Dugard directed the Palestinians towards it in terms of what the Palestinians should do. Do you think that the political split on the Palestinian scene could be bridged, this gap could be bridged when it comes to apartheid, or we have to reach a unified leadership accepted by everyone on a political level in order to move forward with the question of apartheid as a negotiating tool?
Look, I don't think that this will become a main difficult to move forward on the international level before the ICC or before other things. Maybe it's difficult when it comes to the, let me say, political solution. But even with the division, even Hamas recognized that PLO is representing Palestinians and there is the only representative. The question is here to maintain the representation, to be honest with you. And this is, an issues that it's dealing with these days. Without doing this, I think it will undermine the Palestinian effort role to play, a strong role. And this issue, division, Israel is playing, the game to escape from its responsibility here or there, and supported by, some of states in West in general. But this is a political game. But let me also add one point to what Mr. Dugard said. The issue of the crimes against humanity, it's a discussion these days, with the court, and what we heard lately from them, and this is not a secret thing. It was in, let me say, a closed meeting. They are open to all crimes taking place in the occupied territory, including the crimes against humanity, persecution, apartheid, and everything. This is what they said in a very, very clear way, because there is no logic. There is no logic if you open an investigation in situation in Palestine and you limit yourself with just one kind of crimes. There is no logic, behind, except there is a political maybe things. And here I think the ICC and mainly the prosecutor office try to show that they are not following the political pressure on this. She said this clear words, I think one day before she left, and the team of investigation said that too. It's not a confidential thing. And I think the apartheid is a test, because we are the only case to challenge the statute and to challenge this crime. Palestine as a test, I think, for every principle of international law, international humanitarian law and international criminal law. It's clear in that. And apartheid is, Palestine is a test for it. And more than that, Palestine state, they submitted this as also a crime, and as a human rights organizations, we are engaging actively with the ICC. We mentioned this and we submitted submissions on apartheid.
Well, thank you very much.
Mr. Jabareen. Well, I honestly have a couple of questions to Dr. Hasan Jabareen, but I would rather go to the audience now, and I'm sure that you will get questions because we are running late. We are having only 35 minutes, and we wanted to give them more time, and we have very prominent colleagues and friends and scholars, and I'm sure that they will enrich our discussion with their questions. So for the moment, I see two hands. Hasan, I don't see Hasan, your last name, and then Mr. Haidar Eid. So Hasan, the floor is yours. And please, before anyone speaks, I would be really, I'm sorry to say this, but please let us limit our interventions to questions to the audience. Of course, take your time, but let's not take long comments in order to open the floor for as much contributors as we can. Hasan, your question.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, and thanks to our speakers for their quite distinguished contributions to this discussion. I saved some ink by just writing my first name. So my question is to Prof. John about, it's not about the case of apartheid, but about the analogy of the one state, similar to what happened in South Africa. Eventually, South African conflict or crisis or apartheid regime was solved by Nelson Mandela taking over power and creating a one state for all South Africans, regardless of the economic inequalities that persist until the moment. So considering that the two-state discourse is only right now limited to the UN and EU press releases and statements, the one-state solution started to dominate the discourse over Palestine. So do you think that if Palestinians adopt this solution, the PLO, the Palestinian Authority, if they adopt the solution, would that in any way detract from their legal achievements, if we could call it so? Would that lead them to cause them to lose some of the legal recognitions that they attained in the UN and in other international fora? This is my first question. The second one, considering the case of Palestine and South Africa are quite similar, but there are some basic differences as well, like the political differences, in the sense of Israel's stronger alliances with the US or with other superpowers, and in regards of Zionism being a very entrenched ideology. It's a founding ideology of Israel, while in South Africa, white supremacy was some sort of an ideology that sustained the system. It was more of an economic and a sense of hegemony, while Zionism is more complicated than white supremacy, if we could call so. So what do you think of that? The first one about the legal recognition, and the second one about the differences.
Thank you, Hasan. We will take the question of Haidar, and then we open the floor for our guests to answer. Mr. Haidar Eid.
Yeah, Thank you so much. Actually, I'm very delighted to have been invited actually to this fantastic discussion. I just would like to say that I'm South African and Palestinian at the same time, and I think I'm the only guest talking to you from Gaza. So there are, a couple of points here that I want to raise based on the fact that I lived for about 5 to 6 years in South Africa, where I got my PhD degree from the University of Johannesburg, and I also live in Gaza. So, but I do not have enough experience with with the legal discourse that is taking place right now here. But I'm also a member of the BDS campaign. I'm one of the founders of the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. So the question that I want to raise pertains to the question of imposing sanctions on Israel. Most of us here in Palestine, and I want to say before I raise this question that I strongly believe that the regime that we have between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean is, a regime of apartheid and settler colonialism, but it is taking a multitude form of oppression. Most of South African comrades and activists who have visited us here in the West Bank, Gaza, and 1948, from Ronnie Casserels, and I mean including Professor Dugard himself, to Archbishop Desmond Tutu, all of them have said that what we have been going through since 1948 until today is far, far worse than what Black South Africans witnessed in the heydays of apartheid, 70s and 80s. So, my point about sanctions, sanctions is one of the pillars of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which was launched in 2005. But the international community, even though we claim that we are living in our South African moment, yes, the international community, international civil society has been heeding our call, boycotting apartheid Israel. Many companies have been divesting and disinvesting from apartheid Israel. But the point is sanctions. Why has not the international community heeded our call yet by imposing sanctions against apartheid Israel? And sanctions, as outlined in international law, as far as I understand it, are legitimate response to Israel's continuous acts undermining international law. And the failure, I believe, to use sanctions against apartheid Israel makes a mockery of the international legal order and human rights. So that is my point, and that is my intervention. And thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you, Mr. Eid, for your intervention. I think Professor Dugard, you have the floor to answer. At least the first two questions are addressed by Hasan directly to you, and then the question of Mr. Eid about why there is a lack of sanctions is open for any of the contributors to answer. You are muted, Professor Dugard.
May I start with Mr. Eid's question, because I think this is the most important question that we need to consider, and that is, why has the international community, particularly the West European Union and the United States, refused to impose sanctions upon Israel? And the answer is that they are prepared, and they do treat Israel as almost being above the law. And this is because of factors that I mentioned, such as Holocaust guilt, not wishing to be labeled as anti-Semitic, and the power of lobbies. But there's no doubt that this does make a mockery of international law. And it's really strange that even an arms embargo has not been considered by the United Nations. And this is one of the reasons why I think that labeling the system in Palestine as apartheid might help, because it will then be able possible to argue that sanctions were imposed, military, an arms embargo in particular was imposed upon South Africa in 1977, and why is it that it is not imposed upon Israel if it practices apartheid? And that's why it is so important, I think, to press the apartheid argument. Now let me turn to the other two questions that Hasan asked. First of all, the question of a one-state or two-state solution. There's no doubt that if the PLO pushed for one-state solution, and if this became accepted possibly by the international community, that the whole situation would change, that it would then not be possible to argue that there was a conflict between two states, between Israel and Palestine. But I think we must accept that we have a long way to go before the one-state solution achieves support in Palestine or in Israel or in the international community, however attractive it may be. And then there's the question about Zionism. There's no doubt that Zionism is a powerful force, and this does distinguish the position in Palestine, Israel, from the South African situation. There's no doubt that the international community incorrectly is well disposed towards Zionism and is prepared to give Israel a free pass when it comes to violations of international law. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dugard. Now we have another two hands raised. Rawan, who is a close friend, so I will keep her after Dr. Mu'taz Qafisha, who is our professor and dear mentor to all of us. So Dr. Mu'taz and then Rawan. Sorry, Rawan.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmad. I would like also to welcome everybody on my capacity as the head of the Board of Trustees of the Law for Palestine, since it is the first time I meet you after the selection of the head of the board. And also I would like to thank Hasan and his team for organizing this very important webinar. And also I'm very happy to be with Dr. John Dugard. As you remember, we worked together when I was working at the United Nations in Palestine, and I had the honor to organize many of your trips in the West Bank and in the occupied territories. And also, I would like to say that I'm happy also to be with Jabarin Sayers. You are Shawan Jabarin, as two questions. The first, John Dugard, regarding, and probably to Hasan and Shawan if they want to add anything on that, regarding the justiciability of the question of apartheid. In other words, can the Palestinians, or it's a very technical question regarding how or who exactly would be accused before the International Criminal Court in committing the crime of apartheid. As understood, in South Africa there was no criminal charges against anyone. You know, the apartheid convention was there, but no one was charged in committing the crime of apartheid. But now we have a new reality. Palestine is before the International Criminal Court. So who, like members of Knesset, for example, who issue the laws that systematically discriminate against Palestinians both inside Israel and or in the West Bank, or the military commanders, or the politicians, or judges in the High Court. Who exactly? Because if we talk about criminal responsibility, we are talking about individual responsibility. So who would be the individuals? Particularly because most of these individuals are committing other crimes, murder, killing, expulsion, etc. So how they would be charged, and how? And probably this question is more procedural question, and I think it's very challenging question. My other question, briefly to Hasan. It seems, Hasan, that you read the article that was published a few days ago by Joseph Haddad at Ynet when there was a meeting at the Knesset regarding the issue of apartheid, and where he raised many questions that you also raised today. And this probably brings to the fore the question of consensus among Palestinians, because us as Palestinians, and I think this is one of the main obstacles, we don't agree. We don't agree on how to deal with the question of apartheid. Contrary to the situation in South Africa, Black South Africans, even though many of the whites in South Africa were calling to have one state solution and to end the question of apartheid, although the whites are only 10% of South Africa. In our case, if we have one state solution, the number will be 50-50 between Palestine and Israel. And if we consider that hypothetically that Palestinian refugees return, the Israelis will constitute about 30-40% in the best case scenario of the Palestinians. But yet, Palestinians, they don't even agree on anything, basically. So we have on one side the PLO that's calling for state solution. We have Hamas and other factions who call about the solution of Israel, and we have the Arab Israelis who are also fragmented. So don't you think, Hasan, and probably Shawan, that this would be considered as one of the differences between South Africa and Palestine, and might be an obstacle as well? Thank you.
Rowan?
Regarding the technical question,
may Mr. Jabarin, may we take the question of Rowan and then
I mixed between Rowan and Shawan because I hear the two letters I thought me.
No, we will take the questions from Rowan Al-Husseini, our friend in the committee for the Law for Palestine, and then we'll leave the panel for the three of you.
Thank you, everyone. I see that the international and legal, I'm sorry, I just want to turn it off for just 1 minute. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, I see that on the international level and legal level, and in addition to what Dr. Dugard talked about, the Palestinian division, the Palestinian division, and the lack of Palestinian political will to go to the International Criminal Court. And of course, I'm talking here in comparison with the experience of South Africa. My question is, what are the tools that the individuals have and can be used regarding apartheid and documenting these ongoing crimes of this racist occupation? And especially here in Palestine, there's no organizations or other working to document these crimes in case the situation changed one time and then we have this political will and then we can go to the ICC. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rowan. So I think we have two questions related to the ICC, one from the internal perspective of Palestinian, and one very important about who to be tried, especially that the crime of apartheid had never been tried before. In South Africa, there was a settlement with reconciliation and there was no criminal prosecution. So actually one of the main questions that the ICC will struggle with would be whom to prosecute. Is it the current either the current head of state, the former head of state? Apartheid is a continuous crime, so where do we start it and where do we end it? These are all questions that we struggle with. So I think this specific question about the ICC and is addressed to Professor Dugard, and then we'll go to the question to Mr. Jabarin, Shawan and Hasan Jabarin.
Yes, well, I think you've already answered the question. As apartheid is a policy, the head of state or the prime minister and his government would be responsible for practicing apartheid. And let me say, this is the same problem that arises in respect of the war crime of constructing settlements. And this is what makes it so easy, because when it comes to the facts, it's very clear that settlements have been established and this is a crime, but the question is who is going to be prosecuted? And the answer must be the leading political figures in Israel. And this is what makes it very difficult politically to proceed against such persons. But in law, it's no doubt, it's the head of government and the government who are responsible and who must be held responsible for the crime of apartheid.
Thank you. So I think we can move to the next questions to Mr. Hasan and Shawan Jabarin.
It's important, I think, from the discussion to make distinction between the argument of committing crime of apartheid. As Shawan said, you can say Israel committed crime of apartheid in West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem. And you can say also Israel is committing a crime of apartheid inside the Green Line. But that is totally different when you label the regime. When you say Israel regime is apartheid is one thing, and this is another thing to say that this state or this regime committed crimes of apartheid in this area and that area. The most challenging question is to portray the regime as such as apartheid. This is, I think, the challenge. And about this I spoke, not about committing a crime of apartheid in a specific place, but whether the regime, the Israeli regime, from the Jordan River to the river, is apartheid or not. This is very important to make this distinction. About the question of Professor Mu'taz about one state solution, if we speak about apartheid, this is a really challenging question, because if we say Israel regime is apartheid, so then the remedy is to disapartize it, to make it equal regime for all. Equal regime immediately will think one state that every person live equally, one man, one voice, one man, one voice. But this was the experience of South Africa. Doesn't mean that to decolonialize the apartheid regime should lead to one state or two states or three states. The one state, two states, three states, or four states, those are political agreement. Whether the political bodies, they will agree what kind of government that they can reach. The only thing that we can speak about disapartheizing Israel regime, that in every place in Palestine, every Palestinian should enjoy equal rights and human dignity. But doesn't mean that the solution is one political solution. So the political solution is something, and decolonializing the regime is another thing. But I agree with Professor Mu'taz that the perception always that when we say apartheid, immediately we think about a one state. But I don't think that this one lead to the other, because the colonialized regime could have different perspective. The main thing of the colonializing regime is equality and historical justice. About the sanctions, and that Dr. Haider spoke about it, why there is no serious sanctions about Israel as an apartheid. Some of those Professor Dugard answered. I will say exactly because the thinking that Israel managed apartheid only on the OBTs. when you said that Israel is managing apartheid only in West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, you immediately said that Israel is democratic state. Israel is democratic state in the Green Line. This is why there is no sanction against Israel, because you don't put sanction in a democracy. This is why we have to leave the paradigm of the OBT's 1967 and to move to Haifa and Nazareth and the Triangle and the Galilee. By this, you challenge the perspective of democracy. You can continue until tomorrow speak about the apartheid in West Bank and Gaza and Israel. Doesn't bring sanction to all the regime. It might bring sanction on the settlements. It might bring...
I think this point is clear, and as you say, we do not want to speak on it till tomorrow. Mr. Shawan Jabarin, I think you had a comment on the questions addressed by President.
1 minute. I think the question of Dr. Mu'taz is a serious question. I would like to say Dr. Mu'taz would like to give just 2 small examples. One of that is to have a DNA test to register in civil registration file your baby. If you are from Jerusalem, this is required DNA. This is only for Palestinians. This is only for Palestinians from the Interior Ministry and the Interior Minister. When it comes to the family unification things, Knesset members and also the government, and they repeat it every year, and maybe I'm sure that you are following the discussion these days with the coalition and the government and the opposition to vote in favor of extending this. They extended it in the last 17, 18 years. This is an issue. I'm sure that also it's imposed or it's covered the Palestinians inside 48. But we can here deal with 67 area, including East Jerusalem. That's the issue when it comes to the elements of the crime and the crime where it takes place. I mean, for the ICC issue. And we have many things. And here you can connect also specifically with the policies and with the persons. And you have a list of things like that, institutionalized and part of official policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jabarin. With the permission of Professor Dugard, Mr. Shawan Jabarin, and Dr. Hasan Jabareen, with your permission, we will take a final round of questions, and this will lead to a delay, I think 10 minutes delay or 15 minutes maximum delay to our session. I hope that this is okay for your agenda, but there is a lot of questions. So we have 4 people who ask for questions. Hasan, in the order of asking for the word, Hasan, Adel, and then Hiba Birat, and then Ahmad Bishtawi, and then Wafaq Abu Qamar. I would ask each one of you very kindly to limit really his intervention to the specific question, and if he can or she can name to whom the question is addressed in order to have a final round and finish only with 15 minutes delay. Hasan.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Thank you, John, Shawan, and Hasan. When I go through the resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly regarding South Africa, especially in 16s and 70s, I find several resolutions that call for supporting the South African struggle against apartheid by all means, including armed resistance. Now that we are talking about what Palestine can learn from South Africa, I would like to ask maybe mainly John, to what extent did armed resistance have a role in South Africa? And do you see it as a part of the solution to ending apartheid in Palestine? Here, let us consider that Oslo Accords, in which the commitment was made to stop and end all forms of violations between the parties. Thank you.
Thank you, Hasan, for being brief and to the point. Hiba.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmed. Thank you for our guests for their great presentation and for accepting our invitation today. So taking into consideration all the complications that the question of apartheid is facing before the ICC, you know, whether Jews and Arabs are racial groups, risking being, you know, accused of anti-Semitism, the geographic, material, and human existence of Israel, especially in Gaza Strip, and then the Oslo Accords and the Palestinian Authority governing the OPT, and the fact that Israel is not a state party to Rome Statute, and what that means to limiting the ICC, especially you know, when prosecuting apartheid in Israel itself. What alternatives do we have as Palestinians on the international level, especially under the Convention of Suppression of Punishment and Suppression of the Crime of Apartheid? This is my question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hiba. Ahmed Bishtawi.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, and thanks for everyone. I have a question for Professor Dugard regarding labeling Israel as an apartheid state. How we can furthering that? Do you think that what we as academics or activists do is enough, or we need more to do that? Because I believe apartheid is very important because it captures Israeli policies and practices in the experience of the entire Palestinian people, past and present, and it cannot be applied to the Palestinian occupied territories without reference to the discriminatory and oppressive Israeli legal and political regime that predates the 1967 occupation. So that's very important paradigm. The question is, from your experience, Professor Dugard, what needed more to keep labeling Israel as such, as an apartheid state? And also, what's the possibilities of seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice regarding Israel's practices in the West Bank and Gaza? Is it colonialism and apartheid? Do you think that would be benefit this issue? Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. Last question, Wafa Abu Qamar.
Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, and thank you, Professor Dugard, for this session. My question regarding the following Mr. Ahmed point, about the labeling. One of the legal justification I have been read that is label Israel as apartheid is not serve us as a Palestinian, and accusing Israel apartheid doesn't serve the Palestinian cause in general, but rather distracts the attention from the fact that Israel is an occupied power. So we now give up the occupation and the legal consequences that Israel is occupation. To what extent, from your own experience, do you think that the Palestinian-Israel conflict is not about apartheid between citizens of state, as the case in South Africa, but rather that, for example, you know, the occupation that came and that is imposed on Palestinians?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Wafa.
If you may allow me to just reshuffle the last words or the last questions. We have three direct questions to Professor Dugard, and which is the question on the armed resistance from Hasan, to what extent it helped and could help. It helped South Africa and could help Palestine. And the second and third questions are about the labeling of Israel and about the possibility of ICJ. And then we have a question that I would like personally to ask, that actually Hiba asked without naming a person to answer. And I would ask each of the speakers to answer, what other alternatives do we have to enforce or to implement this apartheid question, to mobilize this labeling of Israel on international level, other than the ICC and other than the ICJ. So if we start with Professor Dugard, armed resistance, labeling Israel, going to the ICJ for an advisory opinion, and then we answer the second question by the three of you.
Yes, briefly, Hasan, the question of armed resistance in South Africa was always vigorously debated. It's true that the United Nations General Assembly resolutions hinted at support for armed resistance. There's no doubt that the armed resistance carried out by the African National Congress and the Pan-Africanist Congress were factors that contributed to the liberation of South Africa. But I think at the end of the day, it was the determination of the international community to bring an end to apartheid by means of banking sanctions in particular and economic sanctions. And there's no doubt that the boycott implemented by civil society, similar to that of BDS, played an important role. And of course, there was the internal struggle and the change of attitude on the part of whites in South Africa. So there were many factors that contributed to the end of apartheid in South Africa. Of course, armed resistance did play a role, but I think it played a very minor role. And I think too that in the case of Palestine, other factors will play a much more important role in bringing about change. As far as the ICJ is concerned, in 2007, I recommended that a request be made to the ICJ for an advisory opinion on whether Israel practiced apartheid and colonialism. I still think that this would be useful, but there's no doubt that at present the emphasis is on the investigation carried out by the International Criminal Court, because that will have much more serious consequences for Israel. I should also comment on the question of occupation versus apartheid. There's no doubt that the two go hand in hand, that the occupation is illegal, and I think it's important to stress the illegality of occupation while at the same time stressing that apartheid is practiced. Indeed, one of the factors which makes the occupation illegal is the fact that Israel carries out a policy of apartheid in the occupied territory. Thank you.
Okay, so Mr. Shawan Jabarin, what alternatives?
In a very brief answer, I can say everything is interrelated, and I look at the things not just from a technical point of view. I think there is a role for the public, and the civil society can play and push and pressure their governments, their parliaments, and I look at it as a snowball. It will become big and big by time, and it's a matter of time. And here I think in that front, we can play also a strong role by repeating these things, by also increasing the knowledge about what's going on here and characterizing it in the frame of apartheid and connecting with the South Africa, increasing also the knowledge of public in different places in West America also. I think it's a very important. It's not just to keep things within the institutions. The institution is important, but also in parallel, the other front is very important. When it comes, for instance, to banks, like pension funds and sharings with the banks, raising the issue of apartheid, the illegality, and banning, sanction, all of these things. This is, I think, very important. Business and the human rights and apartheid. I think this is also, it's a very good connection with. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shawan Jabarin. Dr. Hasan?
The most important thing about labeling Israel regime as apartheid is not justify that putting Israeli leaders behind bars in the ICC. In the minute that Israeli figure will be indicted and present in the ICC, the Israeli regime will fall. So I don't see that this is in the end. We speak about it, but anyone who can understand the connection between law and politics, he could understand that this moment we won't achieve, not because we failed, because in the minute before you achieve it, the regime itself will be different, or reconciliation between the two people will be achieved. So let us understand the limit of the law. You cannot imagine that 5 Israeli ministers behind bars in The Hague. At that moment, we know that we reach a different stage.
Keep hope, Hassan.
Huh?
Keep hope.
Yeah, but we are working in order to achieve that, because we know when we get closer, we will win. You know?
Okay, but we totally agree on that, but actually the question starts from what you say. So we agree on that, assuming this is the question of Hiba that I join her with. What are the alternatives?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But now we are labeling Israel as apartheid mainly because to win the moral questions. Apartheid regime in South Africa fall because they won the moral question, the blacks there. And we know how much this is important in the West. The only group that support Israel economically and military and in all the level is the Western country. Apartheid language speak to the Western country. This is why it's very, very important, as Shawan said, to work in the universities and in the civil societies in the West about why Israel is apartheid regime. Because so far, and as we said, one of the main reason that the Western country continue to support Israel, and this is the only support that Israel got, is mainly from the Western country, because they believe that Israel is a democratic state. They believe that the question of occupation is temporary question. So this is why we have to work with the civil society in the Western country to move and to make switch in the discourse. We can build network. It's a huge achievement, friends, that Human Rights Watch organization, one of the leading international human rights organizations with support by Jewish donors, and their main supporters are Jewish donors, they wrote what they wrote. This is, I think, because of the dialogue that we as Palestinian human rights organization make with those Western human rights organizations. So in fact, I see more important to work with the civil society, to work with a human rights organization, to have conferences, seminars in your campuses in Europe about this question, and to make it as the main question. We have to switch from the question whether Israel is democracy or not to the question whether Israel is apartheid or not. This is what we have to switch, to leave the question of democracy to the question of apartheid. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dr. Jabareen. Thank you, Mr. Jabareen. Thank you, Professor Dugard, for your interventions. The final note, the last speaker that I think all of us would agree with, is that maybe our battle is not necessarily in a specific institution that will give us the right, but maybe our battle part, or at least what we have in our hands in this time, is to play the moral battle, to play the public opinion. This joins actually concluding remarks of Professor Falk, whom we had a couple of months ago, where he said that we all see that law and politics are interconnected, and politics, maybe it's not in the favor of the Palestinian cause now, but what could be in favor, what could be a very fertile land to farm is the public opinion of the world, starting from bottom up and top down approach with different questions, including the one of apartheid that has a resonance, specific resonance, and actually that gains more and more ears to listen to what we can say. And this is not to say that we exclude a path, legal paths before the ICC, or legal potential before the ICJ, or political trials inside the GA or even the Security Council. But this is only to stress that the struggle is hard, the way is long, but there could be tools as much as we are perseverant and innovative. There are a lot to thank at the end of this seminar, starting with our honorable speakers who bared with us this delay. Professor Dugard, we were very delighted to have you with us, and I personally benefited so much from your presentation and from your interventions. Mr. Shawan Jabarin, it is a great honor for me to moderate against a panel that you speak in. I owe my admiration to the work of Al-Haq. It was a real pleasure to listen to the enthusiasm of Dr. Hasan Jabareen and his different approach to the question of apartheid, with bringing on the table the importance of looking at the inside, the Palestinians inside Israel on a similar level, and maybe on a more focusing in terms of politically winning cards. It was a pleasure, and I will definitely follow the work of Adala starting from now. So thank you very much. Thank you, Hasan, and all the team who organized this. Thank you for the colleagues who contributed with their questions, and to our audience on YouTube and other forums. And of course, thank you to our translators who always bear the very hard effort of doing the immediate translation, Noor Haqqi and Malik Dirane. Thank you all.
And thank you, Ahmad, for your really smooth moderation. But you, I think, Hasan exceeded the time.
I know. I stopped him after 6 minutes, but he was very pleasant to hear too. So forgive me for that. But actually, I compensated this indirectly by asking Professor Dugard the question and you a question I didn't ask him. And I'm sure that he noticed that.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a nice evening, and looking forward to having you in our future events, inshallah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.